Okay, so you know how you sent us that research proposal guide?
Yeah.
Well, we're going to dive deep into that today. It's like our launch pad,
Right.
So we're going to kind of pull out the most important parts of it so that you can understand, like, what makes a research proposal really, really work.
Exactly.
It's almost like you get like this like insider's view of like, how these huge research projects actually get off the ground.
Yeah, and our mission here is really to break down all these really important pieces of it for you. So, whether you are someone who is thinking about like actually doing research yourself, or you're just curious about the whole process, we're going to go through all the key elements of proposal from, figuring out what that central question is to like mapping out the timeline of the project.
Okay.
The whole thing.
So let's just jump right in.
Okay.
The first thing is laying the groundwork with the introduction. And the guide really emphasizes this idea of starting with a crystal clear presentation of your research topic.
Yeah.
Now, this might seem like a little obvious, but why is it so important for you, the listener, to know how much emphasis is put on this?
Yeah.
Like, why is it so important for the researcher to be so clear right at the beginning?
Well, I think because that initial clarity is almost like a compass for the entire project.
Right.
So for you, the listener, understanding that the researcher needs to articulate their focus right away really helps you to grasp the scope and direction of the whole thing. And it sets the stage for everything that follows.
Right, okay.
And within that introduction, the guide also highlights the research purpose.
Right.
And this is all about why bother with this research in the first place, right?
Yeah.
What's the gap it's trying to fill? What's the point?
Right, it's not enough to just be like, oh, this seems interesting.
Exactly.
Like, it's got to justify its existence, right?
Exactly.
So the guide mentions two things here. Academic relevance, which is like, how does this proposal build on what we already know?
Yeah.
Right. And then also potential industrial relevance. So that's like, could this have real world applications?
Right.
So for you, the listener, it's really about seeing like the potential impact of the research and why this particular area, is important to research.
Exactly. And then at the very core of it all is the central research question or the hypothesis.
Right.
And this is like the single most important question that the research aims to answer. It drives the entire investigation. Yeah. So you can think of it as like the specific problem that's being tackled.
Okay.
The guide also talks about the overall aim of the research, which is sort of like the broader aspiration, the ultimate goal. What is it striving toward?
Right.
So, the research question is like this specific puzzle, and the aim is like the bigger picture.
Gotcha.
What does it all contribute to if we solve this puzzle? And then to get to that overall aim, the guide also mentions subsidiary objectives.
Right.
Or like subsidiary research questions.
Okay. What are those for you?
Well, you can think of these as like smaller, more focused questions that need to be answered along the way. So they're like mini missions that when you complete them, they're all contributing toward achieving that main research aim.
Gotcha.
And answering that central question.
Right.
And I think what's cool about this is that it's sort of like you're breaking down a big challenge into like manageable steps.
Right.
And this is useful not just in research, but in so many things.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's like break it down to beat it up, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so now we've got that foundation.
Yeah.
Now we move to what the guide calls the literature review, which we are calling the guiding light.
Ooh, I like that.
So what does that name mean to you?
Well, because the literature review is all about illuminating the landscape of existing knowledge.
Yeah.
It's not like, you as the researcher, you're starting from scratch.
Yeah.
You're actually building upon what other people have already discovered.
Right.
The guide says that this section is all about detailing the underlying theory, the model, or like the idea that shapes the research.
Right.
And so this, what we call the guiding light, it's also called the theoretical framework.
Right.
And it's the lens through which you, the researcher, will examine your topic.
Okay, so it's not just like, here's a list of books that are related to my topic.
No.
It's more about, the guide emphasizes, explaining how this specific theory connects to your research question. So for you, the listener, it's about understanding the why behind the chosen perspective.
Yeah.
Like, why is this theory the right tool for this job.
Exactly. Exactly. And, to really show that this theoretical framework isn't just some random choice,
Right.
the guide emphasizes referencing supporting books and journal articles.
Yeah.
And so grounding it in all that, in that existing scholarship, it gives it credibility
Mm-hmm.
and it gives it context.
Right.
And it tells you that, like, okay, this person has done their homework.
Yeah.
They know what they're talking about. They
Okay.
haven't just, like, pulled this out of thin air.
Yeah.
So the guide even suggests a structure for how to do this.
Okay.
And it says to start broadly with, like, what is the general theoretical perspective?
Mm-hmm.
And then to narrow down to your specific research area.
Gotcha.
So it's almost like, if you were looking at a map, you start with, like, the whole continent.
Right.
And then you zoom into the particular town.
Yeah. Okay.
And then within all of that, the guide says it's super important to explain those core principles of whatever theory you've chosen. Why do you think that level of detail is important for you, the listener?
I think so that you can see that the researcher understands these theories.
Yeah.
Like, it's not just name dropping, right?
Right.
It's like they're showing you that they know what these underlying ideas are.
Exactly. It's demonstrating a deep understanding
Yeah.
and not just mentioning a name.
Right.
And the guide really highlights how important it is that whatever theory you choose, it has to align with your research aim
Right.
and all of your objectives. It all has to fit together logically.
Yeah. Everything has to point in the same direction.
Exactly.
Okay.
The guide also mentions reviewing similar studies
Mm-hmm.
that have already used the same theory that you're interested in.
Yeah.
So what does that tell you?
Well, that shows you, as the listener, that the researcher is aware of how this theory has actually been used. What kind of findings it has led to, and potentially even, like, what are some of the limitations of this theory? So it's really about learning from previous research.
Exactly.
Okay.
Go on.
Now, here's where it gets really, really interesting, okay?
Okay.
The guide stresses that this review of the existing research, it needs to be a critical analysis,
Right?
not just a summary.
Mm-hmm.
So for you, the listener, it's not just the researcher saying, here's what other people found.
Yeah.
It's about them actually evaluating that other research.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that critical lens, like, what does that add?
That critical analysis is really demonstrating intellectual rigor.
Okay.
It shows that you're not just passively accepting the findings that other people have come up with, but you're actively engaging with those findings.
Right.
You're, pointing out, okay, what are the strengths? What are the weaknesses?
Right.
Are there any potential gaps?
Right.
And it really sets the stage for how your own research, the research that you're proposing to do, is going to contribute something new or maybe address some of those limitations that other people have already discovered.
And the guide also makes this really key
Yeah.
that you need to directly connect this whole literature review back to your own research objectives.
Yeah.
So how does, like, understanding what other people have already done, how does that shape the questions that you're asking? And how does it shape, like, the approach that you're taking? So what's the takeaway for you here as the listener?
Well, for you, the listener, it really highlights that this whole literature review is not just some separate exercise.
Right.
It's an integral part of the whole research project.
Okay.
And it helps to justify those research questions that you came up with. And it informs the methodology that you're going to use.
Right.
And it just tells you that this research is actually building on a solid foundation of knowledge.
Okay.
And it's addressing a genuine need.
Okay, so we've got the what, we've got the why.
Yeah.
Now we're moving on to the how,
Right.
which the guide calls the research design. So this is essentially the roadmap.
Yeah.
Like, how are you actually going to do this research?
Exactly.
So why is it important for you, the listener, to understand this part?
I think understanding the research design really allows you to assess how credible the research is, how rigorous is it. It shows you how the researcher plans to actually answer their questions.
Okay.
And whether those methods are actually appropriate for the task.
Right.
The guide also emphasizes that you need to justify whatever research design you choose. So, why this particular approach?
Yeah.
What makes you think that this is going to work?
And the guide also highlights that you need to explain how the data will be gathered. Like, what specific steps will you be taking to answer the research question?
Right.
So why should you, the listener, be paying attention to these details?
Because the methods that you use to collect your data directly influence the type and quality of information that you're going to gather. And this, in turn, affects the validity of the findings that come out of your research.
Right.
So the guide actually lists examples of different research designs, like a cross-sectional design, an ethnographic design, experimental case study.
Right.
And these are all different frameworks for how to structure your data collection process.
Okay.
So you can almost think of them as like different ways of approaching the problem.
Gotcha.
And then within each of those frameworks, the guide says that you need to specify the type of data that's required.
Okay, so what are we talking about here?
We're talking about like whether the research is going to focus on quantitative data, which is, numbers and statistics, or qualitative data, which is more like in-depth descriptions, maybe interviews with people,
Right.
observations of what's happening, or maybe even a combination of both. And the type of data that you choose really dictates what kinds of analysis you can do,
Right.
and the kinds of conclusions that you can draw. And then the guide goes on to say that you need to detail the methods of data collection that you're going to use.
Right, so that's like surveys, interviews, experiments, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Like what are the actual tools and techniques you're going to use to gather that data? And the guide really emphasizes that you need to explain the rationale behind why you chose these specific methods.
Why is that justification so important to the listener?
Well, because the methods that you choose should be like the most effective way to gather the data that you need to answer the research question. And so justifying your choices shows that you've really thought critically about your approach, and that the methods that you've selected are actually fit for purpose.
Okay.
The guide even mentions, like think about the types of questions you might ask if you're doing like questionnaires or interviews, and really making sure that each question is directly relevant to what you're trying to find out.
Yeah, each question should have a purpose, right?
Exactly, exactly. And then there's this other crucial part about sample selection.
Right.
So this is like who or what will be studied. The guide talks about, the number of participants, how you will choose them, and any criteria for including or excluding, different people or different things.
Right.
So why does this matter to the listener?
Well, because this sampling strategy is really going to affect how representative the findings are. So like a well-defined sample is going to make sure that the data that you collect is relevant.
Yeah.
And that the conclusions that you can draw from it can then be generalized.
Exactly. Okay,
so the last thing in this research design section is the guide talks about the planned data analysis methods.
Right.
And that you need to support these choices with references. So why is it important for the listener to see like what your analysis plan is?
Well, because it shows that you, as a researcher, have a clear plan for making sense of all that data that you're going to collect. And so choosing the right analysis methods is going to make sure that the findings are meaningful and that they can really answer that research question that you started with.
Right.
And referencing your methods just shows that they're based on established practices.
Okay, so we've got the plan for what we're going to research. We've got how we're going to research it.
Yeah.
Now the guide moves on to something really practical,
Right.
which is the provisional timetable.
The timeline, yeah.
So why is this so important? Like, why do you need a detailed timeline for this research proposal?
I think the timetable is really important because it highlights how feasible and manageable this project is. It shows that the researcher has actually sat down and thought about all the different stages involved and that they have a realistic plan for completing everything within, a given time frame.
Right.
The guide actually gives an example of a 9-month time frame to give you a sense of like how detailed this needs to be.
Yeah. So it's about like taking that whole project and breaking it down into smaller chunks.
Yeah.
From like, the literature review to, when you submit the final thing.
Right.
And it's like you can actually see each step along the way.
Exactly. It's like having the whole project laid out step by step and a well thought out timetable, I think. It not only keeps the research on track, but it shows that you as the researcher, you really understand the scope of the work.
Right. Like you're not being overly ambitious.
Exactly.
Okay. So we've covered all of the content.
Right.
Now the guide gives us a little peek into how it all comes together in the end. And that's the research proposal format.
Yeah.
So what are some like key things that the listener needs to know about how a proposal is structured?
Well, the guide specifies that the proposal should be written in report format, which is, pretty standard in academia. It's a standard structure, so it makes it really easy to follow. And it emphasizes, again, this idea that the proposal needs to be super, super focused. So again, that initial clarity that we talked about is really important.
Yeah.
And then the other thing it points out is that, the topic that you choose should be something that you're genuinely interested in.
Right.
And it also needs to connect to your, overall program of study.
Right. It's like passion fuels the work, but you also have to stay within the academic boundaries.
Exactly. And, passion fuels the work. That's going to make for a much better research project. And then making sure that it aligns with your program of study just ensures that it has that academic relevance.
Yeah.
For you, the listener, you know that this is legitimate.
Right.
And then the guide lists those key headings that we've already kind of gone over. So like introduction, literature review, research design, provisional timetable. And these headings act as a framework so that, whoever is reading this proposal, they can easily understand how it's structured.
Yeah.
And they can find the specific information that they're looking for.
And then the guide also emphasizes that you really need to complete each section in detail. So, it's not enough to just have those headings.
Right.
You need to really flesh each part out and explain everything thoroughly so that the listener can really understand what you're trying to do.
Right.
And then finally, it mentions the word limit.
Yes.
Which is 2,000 words, including references.
Right.
So what does that tell you?
Well, a word limit, I think, underscores how important it is to be concise and precise in your writing.
Yeah.
So, every word has to count. It has to contribute meaningfully to the proposal.
Right.
And it really forces you, as the researcher, to prioritize clarity and impact.
Okay, so to wrap it all up, we've really taken a deep dive into this research proposal guide today.
We have.
And we've explored, how a research project starts with a clear topic and a clear question. How it's shaped by, looking at what other people have done, how you're actually going to conduct the research, the importance of having a timeline, and then the format for how you put all of this information together.
Exactly.
So understanding these elements is going to give you a really valuable framework for understanding any research project. Like, it's almost like having the blueprint for a discovery.
I like that.
So it really gives you, as the listener, a sense of like the careful thought and planning that goes into creating new knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely.
So here's a final thought for you to consider. How can you use these same elements? Like defining your core question, understanding the current landscape of, whatever problem you're looking at, planning your approach, and then managing your time. Like, how can you use that in other areas of your life that aren't just academic research?
Right.
Could you use this for like tackling a big project at work?
Yeah.
Could you use this for planning a major life change? Or could you even just use these principles to understand how someone else approached a complex problem?
That's a really powerful point. I think, these fundamental principles of a well-structured research proposal, like having clarity of purpose, having an informed methodology, and a strategic plan. These are actually surprisingly universal. And I think they can offer some really valuable insights into many different areas of life.
Absolutely.
Not just research.
Okay. Well, that was a lot of information today.
It was.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.